My name is Mabel, and I'm 52 years old. I raised my son Trevor as a single mother after my husband died in a car accident when Trevor was just 8. I was so proud when Trevor married his college sweetheart Amy 3 years ago, and I felt pure joy when they announced their pregnancy. But 1 month after my granddaughter Lily was born, something so terrible happened that it shattered my world completely. What my son and his wife did to that innocent baby forced me to make the most difficult decision of my life. Before I tell you what happened next, please let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button if you've ever had to make an impossible choice as a parent, and subscribe because this story will show you just how far a grandmother will go to protect her family. After my husband David passed away in that horrible accident on Interstate 25, it was just Trevor and me against the world. Those were tough years working double shifts as a nurse at Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital while trying to be both mother and father to an 8-year-old boy who missed his daddy every single day. But Trevor grew into such a wonderful young man. He studied hard, earned a full scholarship to Colorado State University for engineering, and that's where he met Amy. Amy was everything I could have hoped for in a daughter-in-law. She came from a good family in Fort Collins, studied elementary education, and had this gentle way about her that reminded me of myself at that age. When Trevor brought her home for Thanksgiving during his junior year, I knew she was special. The way she helped me in the kitchen without being asked, how she listened when I told stories about Trevor's childhood, and most importantly, how she looked at my son with pure love in her eyes. Their wedding 3 years ago was the happiest day I'd experienced since David died. I walked Trevor down the aisle myself, and there wasn't a dry eye in that little church in Loveland. Amy looked absolutely radiant in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, and Trevor couldn't stop smiling. During their first dance to At Last by Etta James, I felt such peace knowing my boy had found his person. When Amy called me last spring, with tears of joy in her voice, to tell me they were expecting, I actually dropped my coffee mug right there on my kitchen floor. After 20 years of raising Trevor alone, I was finally going to be a grandmother. I spent weeks shopping for baby clothes at Target and Babies R Us, setting up the spare bedroom as a nursery for when they'd visit, reading every parenting book I could find at the library. I even took a grandparenting class at the community center. The months leading up to Lily's birth were magical. Amy and I grew closer than ever shopping for maternity clothes together, attending doctor appointments when Trevor couldn't get off work from Morrison Engineering. I was right there in the delivery room when little Lily Rose entered this world on a snowy February morning, weighing 6 pounds and 4 ounces. Holding her for the first time, seeing her perfect tiny fingers and Trevor's blue eyes, I knew my heart had found a new reason to beat. Those first few weeks were everything I'd dreamed of. Trevor seemed so natural with Lily changing diapers, like he'd been doing it for years, singing the same lullabies I used to sing to him. Amy was tired, as all new mothers are, but she glowed with happiness whenever she nursed Lily, or just watched her sleep. I visited every few days, bringing casseroles and groceries, doing laundry, while they napped, treasuring every moment with my granddaughter. But looking back now, there were small signs I should have noticed. Trevor seemed more stressed than usual about his workload at the engineering firm, often working late nights and weekends on a big highway construction project. Amy mentioned feeling overwhelmed sometimes, but I figured that was normal for first-time parents. When I offered to babysit overnight so they could get some rest, Trevor always said they had it handled. I respected their independence, remembering how I felt when my own mother tried to help too much after Trevor was born. The last truly normal conversation I had with them was on a Tuesday evening in March. I'd stopped by with homemade chicken and dumplings, and we sat around their small dining table while Lily slept peacefully in her bassinet nearby. Trevor talked about maybe getting a promotion to project manager. Amy showed me new photos of Lily on her phone, and everything felt perfect. I kissed them all goodbye that night, telling Lily I'd see her on Sunday for our weekly grandmother-granddaughter day. I had no idea that would be the last peaceful moment our family would ever share. By Friday of that week, something felt wrong. I'd called Trevor twice and gotten his voicemail, which was unusual because he always called me back within a few hours. Amy wasn't answering her phone either, and when I texted asking about Sunday's visit, I got no response. As someone who'd worked in healthcare for over 20 years, I'd learned to trust my instincts when something felt off. Saturday morning, I drove to their apartment complex in Westminster. It was one of those newer developments with red brick buildings and small balconies, the kind young couples could afford on an engineer's starting salary. I knocked on their door for several minutes before Trevor finally answered, and immediately I could tell something was very wrong. Trevor looked like he hadn't slept in days. His usually neat brown hair was messy. He had dark circles under his eyes, and he was wearing the same Colorado Rockies t-shirt I'd seen him in 3 days earlier. When I asked if I could come in, he hesitated before stepping aside, and what I saw inside their apartment made my stomach drop. The place was a disaster. Dirty dishes piled in the sink, laundry scattered across the living room floor, empty takeout containers on every surface. This was completely unlike Amy, who kept their home spotless even when she was exhausted from studying for her teaching degree. The air smelled stale, like windows hadn't been opened in weeks. Amy emerged from the bedroom, carrying Lily, and I barely recognized my daughter-in-law. Her usually shiny blonde hair hung limp and greasy. She was still in pajamas at 11 in the morning, and she looked like she'd been crying for hours. But what worried me most was how she held Lily, not close and protective like before, but almost like the baby was a burden she was carrying. When I reached for my granddaughter, Amy handed her over without the usual smile and grandmother jokes. Lily felt lighter than she should have, and she was fussier than I'd ever seen her, making these weak crying sounds that made my nurse instincts go haywire. Her little face looked thinner, and when I asked when she'd last eaten, Amy and Trevor exchanged a look that made my blood run cold. I heard them arguing in the kitchen while I changed Lily's diaper, which was much too wet for a baby who should have been changed hours ago. Trevor's voice was harsh, saying something about not being cut out for this and making a terrible mistake. Amy was crying, repeating, "I can't do this anymore," over and over. These were not the loving parents I'd seen just weeks before. When I offered to take Lily home with me for the weekend so they could rest and get their bearings, Trevor's response shocked me. He got angry, accusing me of thinking they were bad parents, saying I was interfering just like I always did. Amy just stood there crying, not defending me like she usually would when Trevor got unnecessarily harsh. I tried to stay calm, explaining that all new parents need help, and there was no shame in accepting support from family. But Trevor was adamant that they needed to figure things out on their own, that taking help would prove they'd failed as parents. The conversation became so heated that Lily started crying harder, and I could see the stress was affecting her too. Before I left that afternoon, I cornered Amy in the nursery while Trevor was in the shower. I asked her directly if she was okay, if she needed me to call her mother, or her doctor, if there was anything she wasn't telling me. For just a moment, she looked like she wanted to confess something terrible. But then Trevor's voice called from the bathroom asking who she was talking to, and she shut down completely. As I drove home that evening, every maternal instinct I possessed was screaming that my granddaughter was in danger. I'd seen postpartum depression in my nursing career, and I'd watched good parents crack under pressure, but this felt different. This felt like something much more serious was brewing in that apartment. I called my sister Patricia that night, the one who'd helped me through David's death and Trevor's teenage years. After I described what I'd seen, she said something that kept me awake until dawn. "Mabel, honey, sometimes people who seem perfect on the outside are fighting demons you can't imagine. And when those demons involve a helpless baby, you can't just hope things will get better." The following week brought a series of increasingly disturbing discoveries that made me realize just how badly my son's mental state had deteriorated. Trevor, who had always been responsible and predictable, started displaying behavior that would have worried me if he were a teenager, let alone a new father approaching his 26th birthday. On Monday, Amy called me at work during my lunch break, sobbing so hard I could barely understand her words. She said Trevor had left the apartment at 6 that morning with his hiking boots and backpack, claiming he needed to clear his head in the mountains, and hadn't returned or answered his phone by evening. She'd been alone with Lily for over 15 hours, and the baby had been crying almost nonstop. When I offered to come over immediately, Amy suddenly said Trevor's truck was pulling into the parking lot and hung up abruptly. That Tuesday, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I stopped by Trevor's workplace during his lunch hour. Morrison Engineering was housed in a modern glass building in downtown Denver, and I'd only visited twice in the 3 years Trevor had worked there. His supervisor, a kind older man named George Patterson, looked uncomfortable when I asked to speak with Trevor privately. George led me to a small conference room and closed the door before delivering news that made my knees weak. Trevor had been terminated 2 weeks earlier for repeatedly missing important client meetings and submitting incomplete project reports. The final straw had been when he'd simply not shown up for 3 consecutive days without calling in sick. When they'd tried to reach him, Trevor had told George he was dealing with personal issues that were bigger than any job. I sat in that conference room for 10 minutes after George left, trying to process what this meant. Trevor had been lying to Amy and me for 2 weeks, pretending to go to work every morning when he was actually doing who knows what. More importantly, they'd lost their primary income right when they needed it most with a new baby and all the expenses that came with her care. That evening, I called Trevor's cell phone 6 times before he finally answered. When I confronted him about losing his job, his response was unlike anything I'd ever heard from my son. He laughed, actually laughed, and said work was just part of the old life he was trying to leave behind. When I asked what he meant by old life, he started talking about how becoming a parent had shown him that he wasn't meant for conventional responsibilities. Wednesday brought an even more chilling discovery. Amy's mother Linda called me in tears after visiting their apartment unannounced. She'd found Amy sitting on the couch staring blankly at the wall, while Lily cried in her bassinet apparently for so long that the baby had exhausted herself and fallen asleep from sheer fatigue. When Linda asked where Trevor was, Amy said he'd been planning their new adventure and had been researching remote camping locations on his laptop for days. The idea of Trevor planning camping trips while his wife struggled with a newborn and they had no income made no sense at all. Trevor had always been a casual hiker, enjoying day trips to places like Bear Lake or Emerald Lake Trail, but he'd never shown interest in serious wilderness camping. The timing couldn't have been worse, and the fact that he was spending money they didn't have on outdoor equipment when they could barely afford groceries showed just how disconnected from reality he'd become. Thursday morning, I made the decision to conduct my own investigation. Using the spare key Amy had given me months earlier for emergencies, I let myself into their apartment while they were both at what I assumed was a doctor's appointment for Lily. What I found in Trevor's laptop browser history made me physically sick to my stomach. He'd been researching remote wilderness areas throughout Colorado and Wyoming, focusing specifically on locations that were miles from any roads or cell phone coverage. But these weren't normal camping sites with facilities and marked trails. These were serious backcountry locations that required advanced hiking skills and survival knowledge that Trevor simply didn't possess. Even more disturbing, he'd been reading forums about off-grid living and starting over away from society's expectations. In their bedroom closet, I discovered shopping bags from REI and Dick's Sporting Goods containing hundreds of dollars worth of camping equipment, a 4-person tent, sleeping bags rated for freezing temperatures, water purification tablets, and enough freeze-dried food for weeks in the wilderness. Hidden under Amy's sweaters was a receipt showing Trevor had spent over $800 in the past 10 days, money they absolutely couldn't afford to lose. But the most terrifying discovery was a handwritten notebook I found in Trevor's nightstand drawer. Page after page contained detailed plans for a family camping expedition to something he called the reset location. He'd drawn maps, calculated driving times to various trailheads, and written lists of supplies they'd need for what appeared to be a permanent relocation to the wilderness. One page made me drop the notebook like it was on fire. In Trevor's careful engineering handwriting, he'd written, "Some people aren't meant to be parents in this society. Maybe we need to find a place where natural instincts matter more than social expectations. Lily deserves parents who aren't failing her every single day." I photographed those pages with my phone before putting everything back exactly as I'd found it. As I drove home that afternoon, I realized I was no longer dealing with a son who was struggling with new parenthood. I was dealing with someone who had constructed an elaborate fantasy about escaping civilization with his wife and newborn baby, someone whose grip on reality was slipping further every single day. That night, I barely slept as I wrestled with an impossible decision. Should I call the police, social services, Amy's parents, or try to handle this within the family? Every option seemed to carry the risk of making things worse, but doing nothing while my granddaughter was in the care of someone having what appeared to be a serious mental health crisis wasn't an option either. By Friday morning, I'd made up my mind. If Trevor was planning some kind of wilderness adventure with my granddaughter, I was going to find out exactly what he had in mind, even if it meant following him without his knowledge. Friday evening, I parked my Honda Civic 3 blocks from Trevor and Amy's apartment complex and waited. At 9:30, just as I was beginning to think my plan was foolish, Trevor's red Ford pickup truck pulled out of the parking lot. He turned toward Highway 36, the route that led straight into the Rocky Mountains, and I followed at a distance, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The drive took nearly 2 hours, winding through Nederland and up into Rocky Mountain National Park. I'd been to these mountains countless times over the years, but never under circumstances like this, never following my own son, because I feared for my granddaughter's safety. Trevor's truck finally stopped at the Wild Basin Trailhead parking area, one of the more remote access points in the park. I parked behind a large pine tree and watched through binoculars I'd borrowed from my neighbor. Trevor sat in his truck for nearly 30 minutes, and I could see him talking on his phone, probably to Amy. When he finally got out, he walked the entire parking area like he was memorizing it, taking pictures with his phone, and writing in that same notebook I'd seen at their apartment. What I witnessed next confirmed my worst fears. Trevor spent over an hour hiking various trails that led away from the parking area, always returning to make more notes in his book. He wasn't enjoying nature or exercising. He was scouting locations with the methodical precision he'd once applied to engineering projects. At one point, he disappeared up a trail marked Copeland Falls for 45 minutes, and when he returned, he was smiling in a way that made my stomach turn. I followed him home that night, staying far enough behind that he wouldn't notice my headlights. When I saw him turn into his apartment complex, I continued driving to my own house, where I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself that I was overreacting, that Trevor was just planning a normal family camping trip for when Lily was older. But Saturday morning brought the proof I'd been dreading. I returned to the apartment complex early, planning to suggest taking Amy and Lily out for breakfast so I could assess their condition in a neutral environment. Instead, I watched from my car as Trevor loaded his pickup truck with all the camping equipment I'd seen in their closet, plus additional supplies that suggested they were planning to be gone for an extended period. Amy emerged from their building carrying Lily in her car seat, and what I saw made me grab my phone to call 911 before I even realized what I was doing. Amy looked like she was sleepwalking, moving mechanically, without any of the alertness you'd expect from a mother about to take her 1-month-old baby on any kind of trip. She was dressed in hiking clothes that were too big for her post-pregnancy body, and she climbed into the passenger seat of Trevor's truck like someone who'd given up fighting. But it was Lily's appearance that made me end the call to emergency services and decide to follow them instead. My granddaughter was bundled in so many layers of clothing that I could barely see her face, inappropriate for what was shaping up to be a warm spring day. The car seat was positioned in a way that suggested Amy wasn't planning to be able to tend to the baby during the drive, and there were no visible supplies for feeding or changing a newborn during what could be hours in the wilderness. I followed them back to the same parking area at Wild Basin, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. This time, Trevor moved with obvious purpose, loading a large backpack and strapping Lily's car seat into some kind of hiking carrier I'd never seen before. Amy moved like a robot, following Trevor's instructions without question or conversation. I waited until they'd been on the trail for 15 minutes before beginning to follow on foot, staying far enough behind that they wouldn't hear me, but close enough that I wouldn't lose them completely. The trail was steep and rocky, definitely not appropriate for carrying an infant, and I could hear Lily crying even from a distance as the elevation and temperature changes affected her comfort. After nearly 2 hours of hiking, They stopped at a location I recognized from previous visits with David years earlier, a series of small caves formed by ancient rock formations miles from the main trail and completely hidden from casual hikers. I watched from behind a boulder as Trevor unstrapped Lily's carrier and disappeared into one of the caves with her, while Amy sat on a rock outside not moving or speaking. When Trevor emerged from the cave 15 minutes later, he was no longer carrying Lily. I waited in absolute terror as Trevor and Amy packed up their hiking gear and began walking back toward the parking lot, leaving my granddaughter somewhere in those dark caves. The hike that had taken them 2 hours with a baby took them only 90 minutes without her, and I forced myself to wait until I was certain they were gone, before racing to find where they'd left Lily. The cave where Trevor had taken her was small and dark, barely large enough for an adult to stand upright. I found Lily in her car seat, placed on a sleeping bag, in the deepest part of the cave, crying weakly in a way that told me she was already becoming dehydrated and suffering from the temperature changes. Her lips had a bluish tint that I recognized from my nursing training as an early sign of hypothermia. I grabbed Lily and her car seat and ran toward the parking lot faster than I'd moved in 20 years, calling 911 as soon as my phone picked up a signal. The park rangers reached us within 30 minutes, followed closely by an ambulance that began treatment for exposure and dehydration while we were still in the parking lot. As the helicopter lifted off to rush Lily to Children's Hospital in Denver, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my son had been an illusion. The Trevor who had abandoned his 1-month-old daughter in a cold mountain cave was not the boy I'd raised, or the man I thought I knew. He was someone whose mind had broken so completely that he'd convinced himself that leaving a helpless infant to die was somehow an act of love. The most terrifying part was that Amy had gone along with it, either because her own mental state was equally fragmented, or because she was too exhausted and depressed to resist Trevor's delusions. Either way, my granddaughter had nearly died because two people who should have protected her with their lives had instead decided she was better off left to the mercy of the wilderness. The next 72 hours passed in a blur of hospital corridors, police interviews, and phone calls that I never imagined having to make. I stayed by Lily's side in the neonatal intensive care unit at Children's Hospital Denver, while doctors worked around the clock to reverse the damage caused by exposure dehydration and the terrifying stress of being abandoned in a mountain cave. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the pediatric specialist overseeing Lily's care, explained that babies Lily's age have virtually no ability to regulate their body temperature or conserve water. The 4 hours she'd spent in that cave with temperatures dropping into the 40s and humidity levels that would challenge a healthy adult had pushed her tiny body to the very edge of what it could survive. She'd developed the beginning stages of hypothermia and severe dehydration that could have caused permanent organ damage or death within another few hours. While Lily fought for her health, Detective James Rodriguez from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office interviewed me about the events leading up to the rescue. I handed over the photographs I'd taken of Trevor's notebook, the receipts for camping equipment, and my detailed timeline of the concerning behavior I'd witnessed over the past several weeks. Detective Rodriguez listened with the grim expression of someone who'd seen cases like this before, though he admitted that most child abandonment cases didn't involve such elaborate planning or such remote locations. Trevor and Amy had been arrested at their apartment 6 hours after the rescue, apparently unaware that anyone had followed them or discovered Lily. According to Detective Rodriguez, they'd been found calmly making dinner and packing more supplies, as if they were planning to return to the mountains the next day to complete whatever twisted plan they'd conceived. Amy had broken down immediately upon arrest, but Trevor had remained defiant, insisting that they'd been trying to give Lily a better life away from society's poison. The hardest phone call I ever made was to my sister Patricia, asking her to drive down from Fort Collins to help me navigate the legal and emotional nightmare that was unfolding. Patricia had been through her own custody battles during her divorce 15 years earlier, and she understood better than anyone how family court systems worked when children's safety was at stake. "Mabel," she said during that first terrible night, as we sat in the hospital cafeteria drinking coffee that tasted like cardboard, "you're going to have to choose between being Trevor's mother and being Lily's protector. Those two roles are no longer compatible, and pretending they are will only put that baby at more risk. The custody evaluation process began immediately, as Colorado law requires emergency placement decisions when children are removed from their parents' care due to abuse or abandonment. Social worker Jennifer Kim from Denver Human Services spent 3 hours interviewing me about my relationship with Trevor and Amy, my financial stability, my living situation, and my ability to care for an infant at 52 years old. I answered every question honestly, even the ones that hurt to think about. Yes, I believed my son posed a continued threat to Lily's safety. No, I didn't think his behavior was the result of temporary stress that would resolve with counseling. Yes, I was prepared to seek full legal custody and raise my granddaughter as my own daughter, if that's what the court determined was in her best interest. The media attention began on the second day, when a reporter from Denver 7 News somehow learned about the case and published a story with the headline, "Infant Rescued from Mountain Cave After Parents' Alleged Abandonment." Suddenly my phone was ringing constantly with calls from news stations' lawyers offering their services and strangers expressing both support and criticism for my decision to testify against my own son. Amy's parents, Richard and Linda, drove down from Fort Collins on Wednesday morning, and our conversation in the hospital family meeting room was one of the most difficult discussions I'd ever participated in. They were devastated by their daughter's actions, but convinced that Amy had been manipulated by Trevor's mental illness and deserved a second chance after receiving proper psychiatric treatment. "Amy's not a monster," Linda kept repeating through her tears. "She's sick, and she needs help, not prison. Can't you understand the difference?" I did understand the difference, but I also understood that Lily's safety had to come before anyone's feelings, including my own. Amy might have been influenced by Trevor's delusions, but she was a grown woman who had carried a helpless baby into the wilderness and walked away, leaving her to die. Mental illness might explain her actions, but it couldn't excuse them or guarantee they wouldn't happen again. The most heartbreaking moment came on Thursday evening, when Trevor was allowed a supervised phone call from Jefferson County Jail. I took the call in the hospital chapel, hoping against hope that my son would express genuine remorse and show me that some part of the boy I'd raised was still accessible beneath whatever darkness had consumed him. Instead, Trevor spent 20 minutes trying to convince me that I'd misunderstood his intentions, that he'd been planning to return for Lily after setting up a proper wilderness home, where she could grow up free from the toxic influences of modern society. He talked about pollution and technology and social media like they were personal enemies, and about how traditional parenting methods were destroying children's natural instincts. When I asked him directly if he understood that Lily could have died in that cave, Trevor paused for so long I thought the call had been disconnected. Finally, he said, "Mom, sometimes you have to risk everything to save what matters most. You taught me that when you worked 3 jobs to keep us afloat after Dad died." The comparison made me so angry I had to end the call before saying something I'd regret forever. Trevor had taken the lesson of perseverance I'd tried to teach him and twisted it into justification for nearly murdering his own daughter. In that moment, I realized that whatever mental illness or personality disorder had taken hold of my son, it had destroyed not just his judgment, but his fundamental understanding of right and wrong. That night, as I watched Lily sleep peacefully for the first time since her rescue, surrounded by monitors and IV lines that were keeping her stable, I made the hardest decision of my life. I called Detective Rodriguez and told him I wanted to press charges to the full extent of the law and that I would testify against Trevor and Amy in whatever criminal proceedings followed. More importantly, I told him I was filing for emergency custody with the intention of adopting Lily permanently if the court would allow it. My son had forfeited his right to be her father the moment he carried her into that cave, and my daughter-in-law had forfeited her right to be Lily's mother when she walked away and left her there. I wasn't just Lily's grandmother anymore. I was going to become her mother, her protector, and if necessary, her only family. Trevor and Amy had made their choice when they chose their delusions over their daughter's life. Now it was time for me to make mine. The custody hearing took place 6 weeks later in Jefferson County Family Court, presided over by Judge Margaret Chen, a woman with 30 years of experience in cases involving child welfare. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look pale and tired. But the weight of what was being decided there made it feel like the most important room in the world. Trevor's defense attorney, a young public defender named Mark Sullivan, had built his case around the argument that my son was suffering from an undiagnosed mental illness brought on by the stress of new fatherhood and job loss. He presented testimony from a psychiatrist who had evaluated Trevor in jail and diagnosed him with acute adjustment disorder, with mixed anxiety and depressed mood, along with possible underlying bipolar tendencies that had never been properly treated. According to Dr. Peterson's evaluation, Trevor's behavior in the weeks leading up to Lily's abandonment showed classic signs of someone experiencing a severe psychiatric break. The grandiose planning, the disconnection from reality, the inability to recognize obvious dangers to his child, all pointed to someone who was genuinely unable to understand the consequences of his actions due to mental illness rather than malicious intent. Amy's lawyer, a more experienced family court attorney named Rebecca Walsh, took a similar approach, but emphasized that Amy had been suffering from severe postpartum depression and had essentially been coerced into participating in Trevor's delusional plan. Dr. Janet Mills, a specialist in postpartum mental health, testified that Amy showed all the signs of someone whose judgment had been severely compromised by hormonal changes, sleep deprivation, and psychological manipulation. Both defense teams argued that with proper treatment medication and intensive supervision, Trevor and Amy could eventually become safe parents for Lily. They presented plans for residential psychiatric treatment, ongoing therapy, supervised visitation, and gradual reintroduction of parental responsibilities over a period of several years. Amy's parents had also filed for custody, arguing that they could provide a stable home for Lily while allowing Amy to maintain her parental rights and work toward reunification. Richard testified about their financial stability, their experience raising 3 successful children, and their willingness to facilitate whatever treatment and supervision the court deemed necessary. When it was my turn to testify, I stood at that witness stand and looked directly at Trevor and Amy sitting at their respective defense tables. Amy was crying silently, looking genuinely remorseful and broken. Trevor sat with his hands folded occasionally, taking notes, still exhibiting the odd detachment that had characterized his behavior since his arrest. I testified about finding Lily in that cave, about the condition she'd been in when I rescued her, about the elaborate planning that had gone into what could only be described as attempted murder. I described Trevor's notebook with its detailed maps and supply lists, the hundreds of dollars spent on camping equipment while they couldn't afford basic necessities, the weeks of lies and deception that had preceded the abandonment. But the most important part of my testimony came when Amy's lawyer asked me whether I believed there were any circumstances under which Trevor and Amy should be allowed to regain custody of Lily, even with intensive treatment and supervision. "Your Honor," I said, looking directly at Judge Chen. "I spent 20 years raising Trevor as a single mother. I know what it means to be overwhelmed, exhausted, scared, and desperate. I know what it feels like to question whether you're capable of being a good parent. But I also know the difference between struggling with parenthood and planning to abandon your child in the wilderness to die." I explained that mental illness might have contributed to Trevor's actions, but it hadn't created them out of nothing. The level of planning, the research, the equipment purchases, the scouting trips, all showed someone who was making deliberate choices over a period of weeks. Even if his judgment was impaired, he'd had multiple opportunities to seek help, to reach out to family, to recognize that what he was planning was wrong. Most importantly, I continued, Lily is not an experiment in whether her parents can be rehabilitated. She's a human being who deserves to grow up in a home where she never has to wonder whether the people who are supposed to protect her might decide she'd be better off dead. The court-appointed guardian ad litem, an attorney named David Park, who had been assigned to represent Lily's best interests, supported my petition for custody. His report noted that while grandparent adoption wasn't always the ideal outcome in custody cases, the specific circumstances of attempted child abandonment, combined with my demonstrated ability to care for Lily and my stable financial and emotional situation, made me the safest option for permanent placement. Expert testimony from Dr. Patricia Romano, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma and attachment, explained that babies who experience abandonment or life-threatening neglect in their first months of life often struggle with attachment disorders and anxiety throughout their childhood. She argued that Lily needed the stability of permanent placement with someone who had already proven their commitment to her safety and well-being. The testimony that seemed to affect Judge Chen most profoundly came from Detective Rodriguez, who described the scene he'd encountered when he arrested Trevor and Amy. They'd been found cooking dinner and watching television, apparently unconcerned about the baby they'd left to die in the mountains hours earlier. When initially questioned, neither of them had asked about Lily's condition or expressed any worry about her welfare. In my 15 years working child endangerment cases, Detective Rodriguez testified, I've never encountered parents who showed such complete emotional disconnection from their child's life-threatening situation. Even parents struggling with severe mental illness typically show some level of concern or remorse when confronted with evidence of harm to their children. Judge Chen recessed for 3 hours to review all the testimony and evidence before rendering her decision. When court reconvened that afternoon, Lily was with me in the gallery, now 2 months old, and thriving under my care, completely unaware that her entire future was being decided in that sterile courtroom. Judge Chen's decision was comprehensive and unambiguous. She terminated Trevor and Amy's parental rights permanently, citing the severity of the abandonment, the level of premeditation involved, and the ongoing risk they would pose to Lily, even with treatment. She granted me full legal custody and approved my petition to adopt Lily as my daughter. While the court acknowledges that both birth parents may have been suffering from mental illness at the time of the abandonment, Judge Chen said the safety and welfare of the child must be the primary consideration in any custody decision. The evidence shows a pattern of deliberate planning and decision-making that endangered this infant's life in the most extreme way possible. She also noted that my age at 52 was actually an advantage rather than a concern, given my experience raising Trevor successfully and my demonstrated maturity and stability in handling crisis situations. Trevor's sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later in criminal court, where he received 18 months in state prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation and mandatory psychiatric treatment. Amy received 12 months in county jail, with credit for time served, followed by 3 years of supervised probation and intensive mental health counseling. As I walked out of that courthouse carrying Lily, now legally my daughter forever, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness that I couldn't have imagined 6 months earlier. I'd gained a daughter, but lost a son, saved a life, but destroyed the family I'd spent 26 years building. But when I looked down at Lily's perfect little face, sleeping peacefully in her carrier, I knew I'd made the only choice that mattered. She would grow up knowing that she was wanted, protected, and loved unconditionally. She would never have to wonder whether the people raising her might decide she was too much trouble to keep around. 6 months after that final court hearing, life has settled into a rhythm I never expected, but have come to treasure. Lily is now 8 months old, a healthy, happy baby who lights up every room she enters with her infectious giggle and bright blue eyes that remind me so much of Trevor at that age, before everything went wrong. My house has been transformed once again into a home designed around a child's needs. The spare bedroom that briefly served as a nursery during my hopeful grandmother phase has become Lily's permanent sanctuary, painted soft yellow with white furniture. I assembled myself during those first overwhelming weeks. The living room coffee table has been replaced with soft foam blocks and colorful toys that Lily loves to grab and examine with the intense concentration that seems to be her natural temperament. Adapting to single parenthood at 52 has been both easier and harder than I expected. Physically, I have less energy than I did 26 years ago when Trevor was a baby, and I definitely need more coffee to function on the interrupted sleep schedule that comes with infant care. But emotionally and mentally, I'm in a much better place to handle the challenges. I've already proven to myself that I can raise a child successfully, and I have the confidence and life experience to trust my instincts when problems arise. The biggest adjustment has been returning to work part-time at the hospital, rather than the full-time schedule I'd maintained for years. My supervisor, Helen, has been incredibly understanding about my need for flexibility, allowing me to work 3 12-hour shifts per week rather than 5 8-hour days. The income reduction has required some budget adjustments, but Lily's Social Security survivor benefits from David's death help cover basic expenses, and I'd rather have less money and more time with her than the other way around. I've discovered an entire community of grandparents raising grandchildren that I never knew existed. Through a support group at the community center, I've met dozens of people in situations similar to mine. Grandparents who became parents again due to their adult children's addiction, mental illness, incarceration, or death. These relationships have been a lifeline during the hardest moments, providing practical advice about everything from car seat installation to college savings plans for older parents. Lily reached all her developmental milestones right on schedule, showing no lasting effects from her traumatic first month of life. She rolled over at 4 months, started sitting up at 6 months, and is now crawling everywhere with the determination of someone who has places to go and things to explore. Her pediatrician, Dr. Williams, has been monitoring her carefully for any signs of attachment disorders or developmental delays related to her early trauma, but so far, she shows every indication of being a perfectly normal, healthy baby. The moment that brought both the greatest joy and the deepest sadness came 3 weeks ago, when Lily clearly said her first word, "Mama," directed unmistakably at me during her morning feeding. I cried tears of happiness because she sees me as her mother, which is exactly what I hoped for her sense of security and attachment. But I also cried for the loss it represented, the acknowledgement that she will grow up never knowing the people who gave her life, but chose to abandon it. Trevor writes me letters from prison, occasionally awkward attempts at apology, mixed with continued justifications for his actions. His most recent letter included a drawing he'd made of mountains and forests, along with a note saying he hopes Lily will appreciate nature's beauty when she's older. I saved these letters in a box in my closet, thinking perhaps someday Lily will want to understand her biological father's perspective, but I don't respond to them. Amy completed her jail sentence and is now living with her parents in Fort Collins while attending intensive outpatient therapy. Linda calls me once a month to ask about Lily, and occasionally requests recent photos, which I provide because I don't want Lily to grow up completely disconnected from her biological mother's family. Amy has never requested contact directly, and I'm not sure whether that's because her therapist has advised against it or because she's too ashamed to face what she participated in. The question of how much to tell Lily about her origins becomes more complex as she gets older and more aware of her surroundings. For now, she's too young to understand family relationships beyond recognizing me as the person who provides comfort food and safety. But eventually she'll ask about her parents, her extended family, and why she lives with someone she calls Mama, but who looks old enough to be her grandmother. I've decided to tell her the truth in age-appropriate ways as she grows up, focusing on the fact that her birth parents weren't capable of taking care of her safely, but that she was always wanted and loved by me. I won't hide the fact that they made a terrible mistake, but I also won't poison her relationship with them by describing the details of their abandonment until she's old enough to understand mental illness and make her own decisions about contact. The most important lesson I've learned through this entire experience is the difference between loving someone and enabling them to hurt innocent people. I love Trevor enough to hold him accountable for his actions rather than making excuses for them. I loved Lily enough to choose her safety over my relationship with my son. These were not easy choices, but they were the only choices that protected the person who couldn't protect herself. Some mornings when I'm feeding Lily her breakfast, and she's babbling happily in her high chair, I think about the parallel universe where Trevor and Amy got help before their problems escalated, where they learned to be good parents, where I remained a grandmother instead of becoming a mother again. But then Lily reaches for me with her chubby little hands and gives me that radiant smile that makes everything else fade into background noise. She doesn't know that her life began with abandonment and near death. She only knows that every day she wakes up in a warm, safe house with someone who thinks she's the most precious thing in the world. She'll learn that love sometimes requires impossible choices, that protecting someone might mean disappointing everyone else, and that the strongest families are built on actions rather than biology. As I write this, Lily is napping in her crib, one tiny fist curled near her face, breathing peacefully in the afternoon sunlight streaming through her nursery window. In a few hours, she'll wake up ready to explore the world with the fearless curiosity that seems to be her natural gift. Tomorrow, we'll go to the park, where she loves to swing, then visit the library for toddler story time, where she claps along to the songs. These are simple, ordinary pleasures that might have been denied to her forever if I hadn't made that terrifying drive into the mountains to save her life. But they're also extraordinary treasures that remind me every day that sometimes the greatest mountains we climb aren't the ones we choose for adventure, but the ones we climb because someone we love is trapped on the other side. I learned that love isn't always gentle or comfortable or easy to understand. Sometimes love looks like betraying your own child to save your grandchild. Sometimes it looks like choosing truth over family loyalty. And sometimes love looks like starting over at 52, not because you want to, but because a helpless baby needs you to be strong enough to become her entire world. Have you ever had to choose between protecting someone you love and disappointing your family? What would you do if you discovered that someone close to you was putting a child in danger? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and please hit that like button if this story reminded you that sometimes the hardest choices lead to the most important victories. Don't forget to subscribe for more real stories about the complicated choices families face, and share this video with anyone who needs to be reminded that protecting children always comes first, no matter how much it costs us personally. Thank you for listening to Lily's story and mine, and I hope you'll remember that the strongest love sometimes requires the greatest courage. Until next time, keep choosing love over fear, even when love demands everything you have to give.